Hi everyone, my name is Gabriel and this is the Hour of the Raven, your channel for everything Ravenloft, RPG, Dungeons and Dragons, and horror.
On a brief break from our exploration of the Land of the Mists, today we will cover the new domain of Dimulu and its Darklord Saidra D'Honaire, featured in the Van Richten Guide to Ravenloft, and provide some feedback on the changes introduced for the 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons. Are you ready? So put on your best clothes and fancy mask, and let's explore this new version of Dimulu, and find out what new horrors are unveiled to the mists of 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons.
Hour of the Raven.
The new Dimulu is a Ravenloft domain that explores themes of dark fantasy and psychological horror. The domain has been drastically reduced in scope, from a realm of political intrigue on the brink of revolution, to being transformed and reduced to a single city, the capital, Port Alusine, where the plots of its adventures inevitably pass through the great masquerades promoted by Duchess Saedra D'Honaire. The cultural inspiration of the new Dimulu is still pre-revolution France, and the domain seeks to portray a decadent society in an even more caricatured way, in which status and wealth are everything. No one is what they seem, and everyone hides a secret. Some may try to pass themselves as members of high society, to share a life of luxury and wealth, and to be invited to the splendorous masquerade balls promoted by Duchess Donaire. At these masquerade balls, however, being discovered as a fraud is a deadly crime. The need for acceptance and integration into a society, questions about who we really are and how we publicly show ourselves, and even the imposter syndrome, are modern themes and an interesting proposal for exploration in the context of the horror of Ravenloft. While the themes can resonate greatly with modern life, the main inspirations for the history of this domain are older literature works. The main and most evident inspiration is the fairy tale of Cinderella, which is the basis to be distorted for the construction of the Darklord of this domain. Not just the Darklord, but the entire domain is portrayed with a more fantastical and less realistic setting, bringing a dark fantasy proposal, such as distorted versions of the fairy tales by Charles Perrault and the Grimm brothers. The second literary inspiration for this domain is the tale The Mask of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe, in which Prince Prospero gathers the elite of the aristocracy in his castle for a masquerade ball, while the outside world suffers from a deadly plague, without knowing that a great evil already circulates among his guests. The new Dimulu is centered around Port Alusine, and as in a fairy tale, this setting does not present itself as a believable world. The nightmare reality proposed by Van Richten Guide to Ravenloft can be clearly perceived in the proposal of this domain, where a big city exists with nothing around it and without contact with the outside world, and people are trapped in a fantastic reality where poverty and decay are hidden by society for the sake of the glamour of opulent balls of the aristocracy. The domain is the capital, Port Alusine. The region around the city is known as Shutterfall, a place from where many claim to come from, having properties and titles, but this region is also a fraud. Just beyond the city limits lie the borders of the mists, and Shutterfall is nothing but an elaborate lie. The brief description of life in Port Alusine reminds us of a decadent Paris with fantasy elements, where the use of ornate masks is common and neighbors know each other more by their masks than by their faces. Despite the apparent wealth and opulence, most of the population is poor, who pretend to be living in a condition they do not have. This false appearance of wealth and prosperity can be perceived by the watchful eye, as elegant clothes can often turn out to be tattered and patched rags, and elegant banquets are organized with scraps taken from the garbage. Social life is intense in the city, and the aristocracy, whether fake or real, is always participating in cultural events in the bustling capital, which has museums, galleries and theaters. The biggest event, however, takes place weekly at Duchess Saedra's Grand Masquerade, and everyone wants to be amongst the guests, to prove their social distinction and enjoy true luxury. The city government is briefly described and maintains the proposal of the classic setting, with the Dark Lord not occupying the prominent position. Lord Governor Marcel Guignol is the government leader, assisted by a council of aristocrats, among whom is Duchess Saedra. The restriction imposed on the scenario also ends up imposing a limitation regarding the scope of adventures in this domain. Although there are descriptions of some locations in Port Alusine, with many references to material from the classic Ravenloft setting, it is undeniable that the adventures to be waged in this domain will inevitably pass through the masquerade ball hosted by Duchess Saidra D'Honaire. And the book brings some ideas on how to conduct adventures where access to invitations and social interactions are the focus. The new Port Alusine map is quite different from the city map featured in previous editions. Despite this, places were included that, although not described in depth, contain references or reinterpretations of elements of the classic Dimulu. The Grand Donaire estate, the central stage of the Grand Masquerades, is presented as an island, where the opulent palace of the Duchess is located, decorated with gargoyles and luxurious tapestries. The servants of this palace are ghosts who hide their nature behind elaborate masks. The Mother of Tears, the great cathedral of the faith of Ezra, continues to occupy a central position in the city. In the new proposal, the cathedral is no longer a ruin filled with ancient mysteries, but a point of moral contrast with the rest of the domain. Here, her clerics preach the teachings of the goddess, and do not establish any social distinction among her devotees. The Red Widow Theatre is presented as a cabaret, where music and burlesque performance can be found, just like a fantastic version of the Moulin Rouge. Decorated with a statue of a huge spider, the place is also a hunting ground for arachnid shape-shifting creatures which feed on few unfortunate customers. It is interesting to note in this cabaret the reference to a monster from the classic Ravenloft setting, the Red Widow, a shape-shifting creature that seduces its victims before turning into a gigantic spider to devour them. It is a pity, however, that such a monster was not also adapted from the classic setting for the 5th edition. A new element brought to the domain are the 3 Old Gables, a location on the outskirts of the city, close to the Tenebrum Woods, where a coven of green hags can be found. These characters are suggested to fulfill the role of macabre fairy godmothers, helping the miserable population to pass for the aristocracy or gain access to the Grand Masquerade, usually at a terrible price. The Port Alusine map also features several other locations with names that are a clear reference to elements and adventures of the classic Ravenloft setting. Some, such as the University of Dimulu and the Great Library, had already appeared in previous editions, that detail the university's dean, Lord Balfour de Castell, as a member and leader of the Fraternity of Shadows. The Mussel building is also an interesting nod that we can find on the map of Port Alusine. The Mussel family is featured in the book Legacy of Blood from the 3rd edition as a branch of the Donaire family that remained in Mordant. While no details are given about such a connection for the 5th edition, some dungeon masters may try to explore this past to provide clues about Saedra D'Honaire farce. Some other locations and adventure ideas are directly inspired by old adventurers of the setting. This is the case, for example, of the Opera of Port Alusine, formerly called the Grand Opera Nationale, which has an adventurous suggestion directly inspired by the adventure A Night at the Opera, from the book Children of the Night Werebeasts. The House of Wax is another location inspired by these previous adventures, and it has an adventure idea identical to Waxing Horrific, from the book Children of the Night They Created, in which the golem Alexander Dusseur is replacing people with his constructs. The Delacour shipping location also brings reference to another old adventure, Pity the Child, from the book Children of the Night Ghosts. Delacour was an aristocrat necromancer who was using child zombies as labor in his factory, until he began to be tormented by a ghost. Other references can also be found in the adventure ideas. One of them suggests that a captain of the guard has been replaced by a devil and is now deploying a force of brutes under its commands, events that are the exact description of the Taskmaster Lich adventure from the book Shilling Tales, which took place in the town of Shutterfall in Dimulu. There is even a secret reference to the former Dark Lord of Dimulu. At Plegeton Hospital, one of the patients in the insane ward claims to be the real Duke Donaire and has the ability to bend others to his will, in a clear reference to the previous Dark Lord, Dominique Donaire. Dominique Donaire is only mentioned as a hidden reference in the adventured ideas, and the Dark Lord of this version of Dimulu is Saedra D'Honaire, a new character that mixes elements of Cinderella and the Mask of the Red Death. The Van Richten Guide to Ravenloft does not provide stats for the Dark Lords, but it does establish that Saedra D'Honaire has the same stats as a raid. At Grand Masquerades, she presents herself as the Duchess, with ornate robes and her characteristic mask with a bird's beak. Although she can dress up as an aristocrat and trick people into thinking she is human, she is actually a raid, who haunts the streets of Port Alusine as the Red Death, spreading death and destruction. Saedra is described as having a strong and authoritative temper. She sees herself as superior to her subjects and defends her view that everyone has a role in society, and those who do not conform to their position must be punished. She had attained the highest rank in the social hierarchy, and she will defend that position at any cost. However, she knows her position is a fraud, and fears being exposed for what she truly is. Those who watch the Duchess closely can see that her behavior is an exaggerated version of what she believes the life of a noble and aristocrat to be, and she hides her worldly and commoner origins behind a decadent, exaggerated, and opulent demeanor. Saedra D'Honaire's story is a twisted retelling of Cinderella's fairy tale. She was raised on a simple farm by her father, who was a widower. He called her the Duchess, and told her that he was an exiled duke, taken from power by his evil younger brother. Saedra reveled in that fantasy, telling everyone that she was a true aristocrat, despite her poverty. When she was a teenager, her father remarried, but she did not have a good relationship with her stepmother and sisters, who treated her like a servant in the household, leaving her only ragged clothes and leftovers for food. When news of the death of a duke from a nearby region reached her ear, Saedra once more claimed her noble ancestry and questioned her father if he could now reclaim his title. Her stepmother and sisters scoffed at Saedra's wild ideas, and her father, confronted by the situation, finally confessed that he was never an aristocrat. He was a servant of the real duke, but he had to flee and hide after being accused of stealing silver from the kitchen. Saedra did not accept this painful revelation. In tears, she fled to the cemetery, and at the foot of her mother's grave, she begged for help. Her requests were heard, and before her appeared a fairy godmother to grant her wish. Using powerful magic, she gave Saedra a fabulous dress and jewels so that she could attend the new Duke's grand coronation ball. Saedra went to the ball, determined to discover the truth and murder the false Duke, who held the post that should have been hers. The fairy god's mother's powerful magic made her irresistible in the Duke's eyes, and the two danced through the night. Saedra began to wonder if she would have better luck marrying the Duke to ascend to the rank. All these dreams were in vain, however. At the stroke of midnight, the guests began to suffer and die, for despite all the care of the aristocracy, the terrible plague had arrived. Death came fast for the infected, and the Duke and Saedra were among them. While dying, the Duke confessed the truth. He was not the Duke's true son, but the son of one of his servants. Unable to have children, the former Duke had adopted the son of one of his servants as his legitimate son. His real father had fled the court many years ago, taking his younger sister with him, after being accused of stealing silver from the kitchen. Saedra discovered that the fake Duke was her brother and that she was never really of noble blood. Enraged, she plunged her dagger into her brother's heart and tried to leave the palace. Already weakened by the plague, she only reached the main staircase, where she died. She awoke from death, but was being dragged through the mist into the domain of Dimulu, where she finally held the status and position of Duchess she had always dreamed of. She was, however, an undead wraith, and could only pass for a human by wearing robes and masks to cover her spectral body. She now constantly organizes masked balls, where she presents herself as the imposing Duchess Saidra D'Honaire. When she is far from the attention of social life, she stalks the streets like the macabre spectre of the Red Death, destroying those who dare to try to be what they are not, and aim for a social position they do not deserve. Saidra D'Honaire's existence is tormented. The truth is that she roams the street as a wraith, looking for her family. Though she has hurt feelings, she longs to see her father again, but fears that her stepmother and sisters might return one day to expose her. She lives in constant fear of being exposed as a fraud, and projects her fears onto her actions, vehemently accusing anyone she identifies as a fake. In the end, her achievement is empty. As a wraith, she enjoys none of the pleasures of luxury to which she now has access, and can only observe as others revel in her lavish parties and masquerades. Many still prefer to stick with the old classic version of Dimulu, or try to integrate elements from both versions. The new version of Dimulu's domain presents a good adaptation of a fairy tale for Ravenloft, with the exploration of some modern themes through fantastic horror, in a very interesting way. However, in my view, these ideas would be better developed as an adventure than a domain of their own. There is no denying that, over the course of a few sessions, the theme of a recurring masked ball will be exhausted, which would prevent the domain from becoming the stage for a lasting campaign, and the reduction of Dimulu solely to its capital Port Alusine also prevents further development of the setting. The drastic changes promoted that completely changed the domain proposal also led us to question of why this domain is called Dimulu, and not presented as a new domain, since so little besides brief references and the ambience inspired by pre-revolution France are maintained. To all those who intend to use the domain as written in the 5th edition, I recommend you seek out the adventures already mentioned throughout this video, that bring excellent stories set in the decadent Dimulu, and which were mentioned in just a few lines in the Richten guide to Ravenloft. While not necessarily compatible with the fantastic new vision of Port Alusine, I also suggest exploring the details of Dimulu and Port Alusine society as described in the Ravenloft Gazetteer 3, a supplement for 3rd edition of Dungeons & Dragons. Aside this issue, the proposal and themes of the new Dimulu can yield excellent adventures, focused on social interactions and role-playing. If I were to adapt something from the new Dimulu proposed by the 5th edition to the classic setting of Ravenloft, I will make Duchess Saedra to be part of the classic domain of Dimulu, bringing her to participate in the great plots of intrigue. The Duchess could be an excellent addition to the town of Shutterfall, helping to bring more interesting elements to the town that were in part overshadowed by the grandeur of the intrigue plots that centered around the capital Port Alusine. As the Duchess of Shutterfall, she could maintain her extravagant masquerades and attract the attention of the capital's aristocracy to her disputed events. Certainly, Donaire and the Living Brain would pay close attention to this new force and influence in the domain, especially after discovering that she would be immune to their mental influence as an undead creature. Another interesting alternative, suggested to me by a friend, would be to connect Duchess Saedra to the Shadow Fae, who emerged from the Shadow Rift to settle in Dimulu. Perhaps these renegade members of the Fae Court are transforming the reality around them, and the unsuspecting attendants of their great masquerades are unaware that, behind the masks and glamour, are several supernatural immortal Fae with inhuman morals. And you, what do you think of the new version of Dimulu from the Richten guide to Ravenloft? Do you intend to use elements of which of these versions in your narratives and games? Join us, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications, and in the next video we will continue our exploration through the mists, exploring new domains as we search for the whereabouts of the missing Dr. Rudolf von Richten.